Right, thank you. It is a great honour to be giving this talk, and I'll try not to choke up. So I want to present today some of my PhD work under Glenn's supervision. Specifically, I want to talk about the importance of scale and how, as it relates to small-scale fisheries and community-based fisheries management. And issues of scale really kind of underpin a lot of our decisions about natural resource management. So using this really simplified example, if we take these three circles here to represent the spatial extent of three social units. And so these could be areas of management or exploitation or any sort of social cohesion. But here we'll talk about them as the exclusive economic zones of three nations. And then if we overlay some ecological scales that we're seeking to manage, in this case that you can see here, the ecological scales are far, far smaller than our scale of management, and this causes all kinds of problems. If fishermen exploit one of these stocks to collapse, they can move on, catch rates can remain the same, and you can get a sort of serial depletion through these stocks. And then on the other end of the scale, if you've got an ecological process which is far larger than your management unit or your social scale, then again it's problematic. And this time, if you take this ecological scale to be a very mobile or migratory fish stock, such as tuna, then you could see that any one of these management units, any of the costs and benefits of exploitation and management are going to be largely externalised from their management area. So ideally what we want when we're trying to balance these scales is just a rough alignment between our social unit of, say our unit of management and the ecological process that we're seeking to manage. But I became interested in this as it applies to small-scale fisheries because small-scale fisheries are really important in that they provide food security and livelihoods to hundreds of millions of the world's poorest people. As Josh mentioned, this is sort of what Glenn got really into because you can go and make a real difference to people's lives. But as the name implies, they operate on very limited spatial scales. And so this has made them very difficult to manage using sort of centralised state-based techniques. And kind of to fill this void in a lot of places, there's been a real proliferation of locally managed marine areas or community-based management. And largely that looks like an external organisation partnering with local communities or groups of communities to manage their local resource. But there's a legitimate concern that these social scales or these scales of management at the community level are just going to be too small to actually manage some of the ecological processes that we're interested in. So for the last few years, I've kind of been exploring this overarching question of whether there are mismatches in the social and ecological scales that are relevant to fisheries management at a community level. And the way that I've done this is kind of on a case study-based approach. I've really immersed myself in one fishery at one particular location. So the Leon community in Papua New Guinea has kind of become my second home over the last few years. And I wanted to point this out because as Josh said, Glenn, it was really like a core philosophy of Glenn's work that community involvement and stakeholder involvement was not about holding a few meetings, and it wasn't about conveying your results when you were done, but it was about really fostering the involvement of the local stakeholders and the local community throughout the entire project as much as was possible. So to that end, this really belongs to this community because they have done there's literally hundreds of locals have fished and tagged and pulled otoliths and gonads and done market surveys. In fact, they even built a custom research station for our work up there, which is that beautiful house there. But to go back to our question, first we need to look at what the social scales are that are relevant to our management here. And so we've heard a bit today about governance, and in Papua New Guinea you've got this fairly kind of typical polycentric governance where fisheries are managed at a national or provincial or local level, or some sort of combination of the three. And my field site is actually split into two local governance wards, but officially the fisheries are managed at the national level. Unfortunately, or it turns out that really there's almost no influence of that centralised governance on the day-to-day operation of the small-scale fishery there. But that's certainly not to say that there isn't any influence of governance at all, because in Papua New Guinea, as throughout a lot of other places with small-scale fisheries, there's a really strong alternative system of governance, which is called the Customary tenure system. And here, this is where clans or family groups hold the ultimate say and responsibility over their natural resources. So in Papua New Guinea, this is enshrined in national law, which means that really if you're doing any sort of place-based management, this is the appropriate system that you need to be working in. It's challenging in that this here is a map of just the western half of my study site, of my island, and you can see there's actually 5 separate management units managing some tens of square kilometres in total, and maybe 2,000 people. So this is actually fairly typical, though, in Papua New Guinea. That's kind of the average size of the governance that you're working with. And if you look at the other social scale that I want to talk about today, you can see that it actually makes a lot of sense, because that governance system, it evolved to look after a fishery that here has almost complete participation, almost everyone fishes, and it's largely in sort of unpowered dugout canoes. So what I've done here is this is the data from 2 months of fisheries surveys, or creel surveys, and on the y-axis here is the cumulative effort. And as you move any distance along the x-axis from the landing site. So possibly to make it a bit clearer, this red dotted line coming across shows that 75% or 3/4 of the fishing effort is actually within about 3 to 3.5 kilometres of any of these settlements. And they have no real opportunity to change settlements, or it's socially very difficult, and so you can't really exclude any of those single circles from any fishing grounds. So we can see that the social scales of management and exploitation are both really quite limited. So what we next wanted to look at was some ecological scales of management that were going to be relevant. And this is a really highly diverse multi-species fishery, and so we needed to pick a few study species. I'm only going to talk about one today, and that's Epinephelus fusco-guttatus, which is a large, slow-growing, late-maturing coral reef fish. And this really suited our purposes for a few reasons. Firstly, as a study species, because firstly, it is a primary target of the fishery locally, as well as throughout its range. Secondly, it actually migrates fairly reasonable distances of some kilometres to these transient spawning aggregations to breed. So it's actually more mobile than a lot of the other targets of the fishery. And thirdly, it is intrinsically very vulnerable to overfishing, particularly where these spawning aggregations are targeted. And that's exactly what's happened at this aggregation site. It has been exploited for generations for subsistence, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was actually hit really hard with an intensive commercial harvest by the live reef food fish trade, which operates out of southern China and Hong Kong. And the local community actually evicted the trade after they noticed a drastic decline in the numbers at this spawning aggregation. And at that time, they partnered with the Nature Conservancy and placed a small no-take marine reserve over the spawning aggregation, closing it not just to commercial interests, but also to any harvest at all. And that was immediately or quite quickly successful. and it's led to a sustained population recovery, at least of that spawning population, where they were almost absent from the aggregation site when it was closed, to numbers we're estimating of over 1,000 last year. So we could say from a management point of view that that's been a success. But as I said, I wanted to sort of explore all the relevant ecological scales that were relevant to management here. And by protecting the spawning aggregation, that's protecting one piece of a complex life history, and that piece is one that we also know to probably be spatially the most limited. So if we're interested in protecting this population or managing this population throughout its life history, which we are looking at incorporating genetic parentage analysis to look at the larval dispersal distance, and also to map habitat from the captures of hundreds of individuals to look at any ontogenetic habitat shift from nursery areas all the way through to adult habitat use. But just due to time constraints, I'm just going to limit myself today to talking about adult movement patterns, and that is their patterns of movement and migration throughout the non-spawning and spawning season. And so to answer this question, we used a combination of acoustic tagging and conventional tagging techniques. So we set up an array of acoustic receivers, and then we got the local men and women to fish the aggregation for our tagging purposes, and we tagged 80 fish with external tags and 30 with acoustic tags. And then using the data from this, we looked for each individual, we got the maximum migration distance, be it from acoustic data or from a recapture from the fishery. And we did this, and the requirement of using this combination of methods is that it's actually allowed us not just to look at the maximum distance of migration or the fine-scale use of that spawning aggregation, but rather to actually develop a picture of the migration patterns of the population. And so on this graph here, we have on the y-axis moving up is the cumulative proportion of the population that remains within any distance moving along the x-axis of the spawning aggregation. So this dotted green line here coming across shows that 90% of the population can be found within about 5 kilometres, or will migrate up to about 5 kilometres from the spawning aggregation. And so that's this area that's outlined here of sort of around 16 square kilometres of reef. Whereas because of the pattern of migration, we can also see that 50% of the population actually remains relatively close and within a couple of kilometres of the aggregation. And so this much smaller area, or proportionally smaller area of only 2 square kilometres actually contains around half of that spawning population throughout the non-spawning period. And this is really important because once we go back to our overarching question of whether there are mismatches in the social and ecological scales relevant to managing fisheries at the community level, we can overlay those couple of areas over the governance map that I showed you earlier. And from this, we can see that around 90% of the population is actually retained within that single tenure area throughout the year. And this is really important, as you'll remember, because that actually means that most of the costs and benefits of like the opportunity costs of protecting that aggregation site are going to actually be retained by that same clan. And if that works. And again, if we change over now to looking at the comparison of these movement patterns and the fishing effort, remembering again that those red circles there contain around 75% of the fishing effort from any one of those settlements. And here we can see that expanding the protection, as we are advising the community to do, to contain that 50% of the population throughout the year, actually comes at a fairly limited opportunity cost for the local fishery. On the other hand, the tail end of that migration curve is moving into that more heavily fished area. So this is kind of designing the protection to allow for spillover into that more heavily fished area. And so you could ask the question of why should we expand the protection anyway? Because as you can see there, these are not actually in heavily fished areas. And certainly that is true, that at the moment there would not be a lot of fishing pressure in that area that we're looking to expand protection into. But those red circles, the fishing distance, is probably one of the most malleable parts of this fishery here, and that's because any further connection with regional markets or any technological advance in the fishery is likely to have those circles expand considerably. So what we're doing here is really trying to get in place the management that may be required in the future in a precautionary kind of way. So to sum up my question of whether there's mismatches between the social and ecological scales relevant to management here, we can say no, there hasn't been for the adult spawning population. And that's really good news, and because I'm out of time, I won't go any further, but as you'll hear more of from Jeff Jones later, it's quite possibly a very different story when you start looking at larval connectivity, and also the juvenile habitat here is more complex. So I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about that, but no time now. So thanks very much for listening, and yeah, I'm infinitely grateful that I got the tutelage of Glenn for the years that I did, and yeah, thank you.